So the September 11th onslaught on some of America's key structures in the year 2001 showed that no country is immune to terrorist attacks. 19 militants linked to al-Qaeda hijacked 4 commercial airliners, which they crashed into various locations, killing nearly 3,000 people. Since then, the fight against terrorism has dominated the security agenda in many countries. The attacks have compelled the likes of the United States to identify structural changes to enhance counter-terrorism efforts and devise better intelligence gathering strategy. So, what can countries like South Africa learn from the successes and failures of counter-terrorism since 9/11? And how has September 11th shaped the global fight against terrorism? Let's discuss. We're joined by the founding director of the South African Terrorism Analyst Center, Andy Grudko, as well as the editor-in-chief of the International Interest, Sami Hamdi. Gentlemen, welcome to the agenda.
Thank you.
Good morning to you all, listeners.
Sami, if I can start with you. Reportedly, America has spent more than $2 trillion on the war in Afghanistan. Thousands of people have been killed over the 2 decades. What has been achieved?
The reality is none of the aims and objectives that the US set out to achieve when it embarked on its war in Afghanistan or the war in Iraq have actually been achieved. And I think that was made resoundingly clear in that as Biden withdrew from Afghanistan, as the last flights were leaving Kabul airport, we saw an attack by ISIS-K, essentially showing the world that if the aim of the US was to remove terrorism, terrorism is still very much alive and still very much operational. If the aim, as Biden suggested, was simply terrorism and not democratic state building, then it has been an emphatic failure, and it's plunged the region into a perpetual chaos in which it seems at the moment that there is no end in sight. And I think it's important to put that into perspective, in that the US, for all of the money that it spent, for all of the presence of its forces, for all of the governments that it helped to prop up, whether that's in Iraq, whether that's in Afghanistan, for all of the PR rhetoric that it's about building democracy, for all of the Hollywood vilification of these terrorists, but making them look like the rest of the people in the region, for all of the collective punishment, for all of Guantanamo Bay, for all of the Bagram Air Base, for all of the extra ultra-virus torture and abandoning human rights for the sake of trying to preserve security, rather than actually combating terrorism. All it's done is exacerbated the fight against terrorism. It's divided what was once a much more unified world in terms of how it viewed common values and the like. It's given rise to this multipolar world. And what it's actually achieved more than anything else is that it has now undermined the status of the US as this global superpower. The US has been seen to be defeated. The US has been seen to have been self-interested in more recent times, following the Trump administration, and now with Biden not necessarily consulting with allies with regards to the withdrawal of Afghanistan, Gulf states reconsidering their security agreements with the US, China and Russia seeking to capitalize over the mess that has been that's unfolding in Afghanistan. All we've seen is a series of successive failures, and I think, and perhaps we might go into this later, and I'll finish on this point before handing over, and I think primarily because where there needed to be a rational discussion over how to combat terrorism, instead we saw a blind lashing out on the part of the US that prevented the necessary rational debate that, in fact, I argue, is only starting to take place now, 20 years later, when suddenly it's dawning on everybody that all we really saw over the past 20 years was carnage, not any pursuit of a sincere resolution.
Well, Andy, let's pick up where Sami left off with regards to terrorism and the strategy going forward. But basically, let's break it down in terms of what is terrorism. Do you find that there's a shifting definition of terrorism?
Well, all countries have a definition of terrorism written into their statute books these days, and obviously it's a highly politicized view. We must not forget that our ANC government were considered to be terrorists by the United States. Well, not our government, the ANC party, in particular, Consular Sizwe, were considered by the US to be terrorists, and even Mandela himself was on the terrorist watch list, even after he became president for a number of years. So the American perspective is going to be very different to, for instance, the Pakistani perspective or even the Northern Ireland perspective. Generally, the terrorism definition, it includes that there will be acts of violence which are going to be illegal, and that they will have a political a foundation behind them, that there is a goal which is political. The definitions themselves should not be leaning left or right. They shouldn't take any particular religious slant. There are terms, of course, which are used by religious groups which may indicate that they are leaning towards violence to achieve their aims. But the actual definition used by governments should be free from politicization and religious dictates.
Right. And Andy, just help us understand counter-terrorism, and there's a term that I've heard, counter-insurgency. Loaded concepts, you would agree, but there's a difference. Help us understand these two terms, Andy, in the context of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Well, insurgency and terrorism are closely related, except that insurgency is more obvious. It's similar to what we saw the month before last in South Africa, where the public rise up, as well as covert forces normally driven by the intelligence departments of political organizations, whereas terrorism itself tends to be completely covert in its planning and in its operation until they literally hit the street or until the bomb goes off. If you take as an example the 2015 attacks in France, they were meticulously planned. They had something like, I think, 170 casualties, fatalities in those attacks, and they were carried out in a very short space of time as a terrorist operation, quite finely honed. Whereas an insurgency tends to be more random. It will be the people rising up, and as we saw, burning, we won't say the looting, that's a byproduct, but rising up against the government. And this generally scares governments to their foundation, because most coups start that way.
Let's go back to what's been happening in Afghanistan, Sami. The Taliban of today, compared to the Taliban of 20 years ago, in terms of the ideology, in terms of their worldview, is there any difference?
I think that's difficult to ascertain. I think what is clear is that their rhetoric is far different than it used to be. I think the rhetoric that when they imply that we got it wrong in the 1990s, as Zabihullah Mujahid, the spokesman of the Taliban, alluded to when he gave his press conference, I think when we're seeing Taliban soldiers on the streets not looting, not rioting, not killing, not embarking on revenge attacks in broad daylight, as we saw in 1996 when they dragged the former President Najibullah and essentially executed him in public, when we're seeing that there's a concerted effort on the part of the Taliban to present themselves as a capable government that is worthy of international recognition, when we see that they are reaching out in order to actually engage in serious negotiations, albeit in the pursuit of international recognition, when we see a concerted social media campaign whereby they are seen to be speaking with female nurses, telling them, go back to your jobs, and speaking to other females and to saying, go back to the government jobs. Of course, all this is rhetoric. Of course, a lot of it is PR. Of course, a lot of it is in this pursuit of international recognition. It's not clear if it will continue after international recognition, but there's certainly a more of a sensitivity or more of an awareness, or at least more of a political maturity in terms of what should be done in order to be recognized as an international government. This doesn't necessarily mean that the ideologies have changed. This doesn't necessarily mean that the ideas have changed. And it's important to stress that even if we're looking at it from an Islamic perspective, the reality is that even in the Muslim world, the Taliban were definitely seen to be more towards the extreme side of things in terms of their approach to female education, in terms of their approach to women's rights. But the reality is that, as the UK Chief of Defence Staff said in an interview with Sky News, the narrative around the Taliban is changing. Whereas before everybody was calling them terrorists, the UK Chief of Defence Staff called them country boys who have an aversion to corruption. The UK Chief of Staff was saying that perhaps the Taliban should be given a chance, and that there are positive signs that are emerging. We're seeing Pentagon officials talk about working with the Taliban, albeit not necessarily going to the extent of international recognition. We see the Taliban willing to work with the Qataris and with the Turks in terms of re-establishing Kabul airport, re-establishing commercial flights, quickly trying to restore some sort of sense of state normalcy. And we're even seeing them engage now with European ambassadors and the like.
Let's just talk about that,
in terms of
Sami.
these steps, they do appear different.
Well, let's just talk a bit about that, Sami, with regards to them. You know, reality is that they are set to write the next chapter of Afghanistan's history. Economically, politically, culturally, what is that likely to look like in the next 5 to 10 years?
That's a very difficult question. I think in Afghanistan, when we're looking at the situation or how people perceive what the next 10 years will be like, it's important to compare it to what the past 20 years have been like, in that the propping up of a corrupt government, the lack of recourse to justice, the lack of economic development, the increased nepotism, the lack of a meritocracy, and the like. And indeed, even the Taliban government that's been formed, albeit it's not inclusive, it's not diverse, there is a consensus amongst those who are observing Afghanistan that a lot of the people who've been appointed are appointed based on their merits in terms of their fight against the Americans and the like, rather than just trying to settle internal debates. But with regards to moving forward, the reality is that, one, Afghanistan is a very conservative society, and even the Pew research report went and produced a result in which more than 90% of Afghans do not have an aversion to Sharia law. So in this regard, there is not necessarily an issue for the Taliban. In terms of cultural changes and economic changes, if we start with the cultural, there'll definitely be more conservative elements being restored with regards to the hijab or the like, that the Americans spent a lot of money to try to remove, and as one American commentator put it, in order to remove the dress and replace it with a skirt. In terms of economic development, that's where things get much tougher, primarily because if you're looking at the amount of money the Americans spent in Afghanistan and they weren't able to produce that economic development, the Taliban now are hamstrung. They have to either go to the Chinese, they have to try to secure those finances, but to do that, they have to secure international recognition. To secure the international recognition, they have to temper some of the more extreme elements. If they temper some of the more extreme elements, they risk imploding, given that they are formed based on a number of factions brought together by a common idea. So it's far more uncertain. It's very difficult to make such predictions.
Well, let's look at it from a counter-terrorism point of view, Andy. When you assess America's longest war, its involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq, in your opinion, did they have a strategy, benchmarks? What would be considered a victory going in?
Well, counterterrorism, of course, has got primarily an intelligence-driven method of operating. So, for instance, if one looks at the military activities of the Americans in Afghanistan, everything which they did was intelligence-driven. Whether they were correct or not, I see there was recently a Hellfire missile hit a private vehicle in Afghanistan. 10 civilians were killed, and it's being declared by the government there as having been a completely innocent group of people who were killed by this Hellfire missile, which implies that the intelligence was incorrect. But just to refer back to something that Sami was talking about there, I recall quite clearly the 1980s, when the Russians were the ones that were trying to take over Afghanistan because of the value of mineral wealth and oil pipelines and various other commercial considerations. And they were well beaten by the Mujahideen, and the Russians then left. The Americans should have learned a lesson from that straight away. But unfortunately, it would appear they didn't. They have a fairly arrogant approach. They believe they are the world's policemen, and that they could go in and sort out, as it was there, al-Qaeda, the problem after 9/11. Not considering, of course, that the battlefield was literally on the other side of the planet, and that they were fighting against a cause which was largely supported by the people. So it's very difficult for an organization like the United States military to deal with this if their intelligence is not good.
Right.
That was their fallback, and that's been our fallback here in South Africa.
Let's speak about intelligence and what we can learn here in South Africa, Andy. We've often heard this in international media, this term called lone wolf terrorism. Many of us have heard this term of late. It is often used to describe someone who acts alone in an attack. How difficult, Andy, is this to police in a country like South Africa, in Africa in general?
We're fortunate in South Africa that for various reasons, partly historical, our alliances with our support for Palestine, our support for Cuba, groupings like that, that we are not really a target for terrorism. What we are a target for is radicalization. We saw it in the late 90s with Samantha Laithwaite, who was known as the White Widow, who was radicalized after her husband was killed in what she says was an unjust paramilitary operation, and that radicalized her. We, of course, also have a problem in our justice system. If you look at the Tasuli twins, who in 2016 were arrested for plotting to attack targets in South Africa in support of ISIS-based goals, that case is still going through the courts 5 years later. So we not only have an intelligence problem, even when the intelligence forces manage to intercept and stop people like the Tasuli twins, we're then let down by the prosecutorial service.
Sami, last word to you. You spoke about this earlier on. Talk to us about the formal diplomatic engagements with the Taliban up to the present time. Which countries would be interested in opening up dialogue and taking the diplomacy route? Do you think South Africa will be one of those countries who will be open to dialogue with the Taliban?
I think that a lot of the countries are very worried in terms of what Biden actually plans. It's not clear how Biden plans to approach Afghanistan. It's not clear if he has any plan whether to recognize the Taliban or sanction them. And the reality is, even when you're looking at statements coming out of Europe, it appears the Europeans themselves are not sure what to do. Macron appears, the French president is trying to appear to take the lead and saying we will not recognize the Taliban. And then you have the British officials coming out and saying that while we might not recognize them immediately, let's see how things develop. So it's clear that everything is all over the place. So for countries such as Pakistan, such as Qatar, who are allies of the Taliban, countries such as Turkey, which are trying to woo the Taliban, they are having dialogue, they are engaging with the Taliban without officially recognizing them. And China is doing the same. And I think that when it comes to South Africa and the other African states in and of themselves, who perhaps have this affinity historically towards driving out occupiers, driving out invaders, there is a lot of African sympathy, or rather a lack of sympathy on the part of Africans for the US presence in Afghanistan. There is rather a preference for national reconciliation in Afghanistan between the various tribes, because let's remember that when the Afghans kicked out the Russians in the 1990s, the problem was they couldn't reconcile afterwards. The individual factions fell into a civil war, and then the Taliban won that civil war and then came to power in 1996. And then, of course, all hell broke loose in 2001. But the direct answer to your question is that a lot of the nations, including South Africa, will not form a clear policy on Afghanistan that involves international recognition of the Taliban until it becomes clear exactly what Biden intends, or whether Biden's leverage is completely destroyed in Afghanistan. In other words, either to see if Biden will recognize, whether he will impose sanctions, or whether it turns out that what Biden thinks is absolutely irrelevant and China swoops in and instead gives the Taliban the support that it needs.
Sami Hamdi, Editor-in-Chief of the International Interest, as well as the Founding Director of the South African Terrorism Analysis Center, Andy Grudko. Gentlemen, we thank you very much indeed for joining us, especially on a Sunday. Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.